But welcome to our third session with Bob this morning. So we will turn it over to Bob.
Thank you.
Begin on this
Good
session.
morning.
Thank
Good early
you.
morning to everybody this morning. I've just told a couple of people that we're dog sitting this weekend for Mary's sister. And when I got up at 7 o'clock this morning, normally he gets out of bed, wags his tail, and said, "Let's get at it." I got out of bed this morning. He looked at me, rolled over, and said, "What are you doing up?" So I have a feeling that there are other dogs out there that are getting a little extra nap, and good for them. It's good to be gathered here together, and for those who are live streaming from home, welcome. As I've done the last couple of weeks, I'd just like to read the two paragraphs at the top of the sheets that hopefully you have a copy of in hand, just by way of explaining what we're about during these 3 weeks that come to a close today. During these first 3 Sundays of the season of Lent, the adult education focus has been on instances during and meanings rooted in Holy Week, the week between Jesus' Palm Sunday entry into Jerusalem and his resurrection on Easter. Accompanying each Sunday's gospel text have been 1 or 2 readings based on memories from my experiences in pastoral ministry. This morning, the hope remains that the following scriptural texts and readings will prompt reflection around the circle of all present, including those live streaming from home. Though I am willing to answer any clarifying questions about my readings, it is really my hope and that of the adult education ministry team that all present will feel at liberty to ponder aloud whatever the scriptural texts and the accompanying readings may elicit. And just a word of what this morning's focus or flow will be like. I would really like to have 2 readings. One that is the second that really is a carryover from the first that we never got to. The first is going to be what we'll talk about for about half an hour or a little bit more maybe, but somewhere around 10:20 or 10:25, I'm going to be suggesting that we then move to the second reading. I'll read it. We'll have just a few minutes of reflection upon it before we close at 10:40. Please join me in prayer. Gracious God, bless our reflection. Enable us to be attentive to your Spirit's leading. Inspire within us a sense of what it means to be filled with hope that is rooted in the good news of Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. You'll see that there are 2 texts this morning that I placed before us. The first from the 27th chapter of Matthew, these words, "Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in 2, from the top to the bottom." And then from Hebrews, a passage that isn't necessarily reflective of Lent, but there is a connection with what we've just read about the moment of Jesus' dying. We read from Hebrews chapter 6, "We have this hope, a secure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters the inner shrine behind the curtain, where Jesus, a forerunner on our behalf, has entered, having become a high priest forever." And this reading is entitled Hope. "The look on my father's face was one I was unaccustomed to seeing. His expression was one of sadness, but also of peace, maybe even of awe. Less than a year following Mom's passing from cancer at the age of 56, Dad and I were sitting in his quiet living room in New Jersey. I was visiting, taking a day away from my seminary classes in Connecticut, catching up with him as he was beginning to adjust to widowhood. Just a handful of days earlier, Dad had returned from another one of his exhausting semi-annual 3-week-long treks to the other side of the globe. Those lengthy trips were part and parcel of his ministerial and administrative responsibilities as the National Council of Churches executive who related closely with churches throughout East Asia and the South Pacific. On this particular occasion, he had visited with church leaders in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Samoa, and Fiji. As had been the case on many previous such trips, he had returned home physically weary, but spiritually renewed. That seemed once again to be the case as he and I sat together in his living room. After we had a chance to catch up about any number of family-related issues, I then asked him how the 3 weeks overseas had unfolded. That was when his face revealed that unexpected mix of sadness and peace, and even of awe. "Well, Bob," he said, "something happened that still has me almost speechless." I nodded, and then he continued. "I had the chance to visit with 2 pastors, one in Seoul and the other in Manila. They were each in solitary confinement, and I was the first one to be allowed to see them in person in weeks, if not months." That's when his eyes began to water a bit, but with those tears came the hint of a smile. I realized in that moment I was about to hear something unique, even divine. A bit of background. The year was 1978. For well more than a decade, both South Korea and the Philippines had been led by dictatorial leaders. Park Chung-hee was the army general who ruled South Korea with autocratic martial law ferocity in Seoul. Similarly, Ferdinand Marcos was the iron-fisted president in Manila. Though their rules would inevitably come to incendiary ends in the next few years, their domination of their country's citizens was currently uncompromising and cruel. As I had learned from my father in the previous few years, many churches in both nations had become settings of vocal objection to their country's autocratic rule. A growing number of pastors, to their inestimable credit, had begun to preach from their pulpits about the God-given rights of their homeland's citizenry that were being repressed beyond measure. In due course, both Park and Marcos opted to suppress those prophetic voices. A Korean Presbyterian minister was summarily arrested by Park's military police and then imprisoned in solitary confinement. Likewise, a Filipino Catholic priest was taken into custody and ultimately sequestered in solitary confinement. In both instances, as Dad learned, they were allowed virtually no visitors. Feeling compelled to express America's objection to this unjust treatment of these 2 clergymen, Dad communicated with the State Department in Washington, D.C. Given the enormous military and economic support the U.S. was providing to both South Korea and the Philippines at that time, as well as President Jimmy Carter's stated commitment to human rights, Dad managed to secure from the State Department 2 letters. One was addressed to President Park's regime, the other to President Marcos's. In each instance, the letter requested in firm terms that my father was to be allowed access to each prisoner. Dad had then flown across the Pacific. Upon arriving in Seoul, he communicated with the appropriate government officials, presenting his letter from the State Department. In due course, under the watchful, distrusting eye of Korean intelligence operatives, my father was allowed entry into the prison where the Presbyterian minister was in solitary confinement. Likewise, a week later, he was led into the holding cell of the Catholic priest in his Manila prison. In both instances, he visited one-on-one with the prisoner, conveying to each the deep, prayerful concern and support of their Christian sisters and brothers in the U.S. As Dad and I now sat in his living room, not more than a handful of days since he had been able to embody that pastoral presence in the prison cells of those two ministers, Dad began to describe for me a bit of the two conversations he had had with them. Each of the men, he said, was understandably lonely. They missed their loved ones. They yearned to be reunited with their parishioners. And they were sincerely moved to have this previously unknown minister from the U.S. now sitting with them, assuring them they were not forgotten. But then my father's eyes began to water a bit, and that trace of a smile began to show. "Bob," he said, "it's what then happened in both of those solitary confinement cells that I want to tell you about." I remember getting a bit of a chill, not knowing at all what he was going to disclose. "What, Dad?" Looking over my shoulder, not at the living room wall, but well beyond, he said, "Each of them told me what he had begun to experience." I nodded and waited, and then Dad said, "Each of them told me he had begun to experience hope. Hope. In fact, each of them told me he had begun to realize he had never before reflected on hope in as real a way as he was doing there all alone in that lonely cell." Then Dad looked me in the eye and said, "And each of them told me he was beginning to write about a theology of hope, about how God was with him in a way he'd never yet experienced out in the wider world. Each of them told me he was feeling in his bones and in his art that God was there with him in as undeniable a way as he'd ever felt to that point in his life, and that God would never, ever leave him, no matter what." Dad stopped. I waited for him to continue. After a meaningful silence, he said, "And neither of them knew anything about the other. How could they have?" Again, the tears and the smile. I just happened to be the fortunate one to receive this priceless gift of both men telling me about hope in the most hopeless settings imaginable. I confess I don't recall how I responded to Dad's words, but I do remember how I felt. I was moved beyond measure. I was touched with both a sense of peace and a surge of passion. Those two men, who had never met and were as isolated as anyone could ever be, were clearly, indisputably embraced by the same divine. They were each clothed with a matchless, spirit-nourishing gift, hope. Not the kind one may feel in ordinary circumstances. No, the kind that is rooted in the extraordinary, in the eternal. I thought about that quiet exchange in my dad's living room on any number of occasions. Each time I do, the memory stirs me. It awakens me. Actually, I confess, it rebirths hope within me. Could it be our God gives to us the gift of hope when we least expect it, but most need it? My dear father's experience in those two cells with those two brothers in Christ argues just that. And I, for one, couldn't ask for a more priceless gift. We have mics for those who have comments, additional words to share, personal stories.
This isn't the sort of comment you're hoping to elicit, but it's a question for you, Bob, about the process of creating this. My mind goes, as it often has, to the writing of the Gospels, which were written many years after Jesus' life by those who witnessed him and who then captured his words. And how did they do that? Did they remember that? Or was it they recapturing the gist and creating an historical narrative? And you're sort of like that situation in writing these memoirs, I presume. I remember getting a bit of a chill. What, Dad? Looking over my shoulder, not at the living room, but well beyond. Are you trying to recreate a mental image of the essence of this conversation, or is your memory just a whole lot better than mine?
Well, by way of answering, I have conversation with loved ones, with friends of late, and now that I'm almost 70 years old, what I find happening frequently is right after something was said, they'll say, "What did you say?" And I'll say, "Actually, I don't remember." Which is to say that memory, I find in writing this, is a category distinct from historical recollection. My memory, as I compose these stories, is rooted in feeling, I think probably more than historicity. So did the conversation with my dad sound exactly like that? No, of course not, because I can't prove it, nor does it in some respects matter to me anymore that I can. And in some respects, Dave, you're drawing a parallel to the writing of the Gospels, I think is an appropriate parallel. I think that every time one recalls something, one is not just drawing the past back to the present, but is creating something new in the present that means something for the moment. Over the last few years of retelling past memories, what I found myself saying is that I am writing parable more than history, and that's fine. And in fact, there's a pretty good model out there to suggest that there is a reason for parable, as opposed to simply, if I were to retell the story, it would be in a historical way. I think it would be almost flat and would not carry meaning. That I think that parable is what, as Jesus used, far more a stimulus for self-inquiry and, quite frankly, faith birth. Not sure if that's a fair answer to your question.
Thank you, Judy. Hi, I'm Dan. And there's, maybe others feel this way too. I feel this almost unseemly urge to know more about those pastors. It's not really the point. Did they ever meet? Did they ever write? Did they get out? But what I think I'm drawn to in those maybe somewhat puerile questions is something I think might be a little deeper, and that is, they were feeling hope then. Was there an initial feeling of hopelessness before the hope came? And that's asking for a friend, so to speak. There are times when it feels really hopeless to me. And there is that period. And so I'm wondering if your narrative if you have any response to that about the sense of hopelessness that not always, but often comes before the profound sense of hope.
If you're asking me personally, and I think we can spread this around the circle because everyone's experience, I think, applies. My sense from how my dad was describing these men was that the gift of hope was not something that they anticipated being given. To the contrary, it was a transformative surprise. As opposed to these men were models for spiritual discipline and were on their knees praying and knew exactly how to pray for this gift, and then God said, oh, okay, then to you I will give it. No, but to the contrary, it was the exact opposite of that particular simplistic model of where does hope come from, which in some respects is I think embedded in my last reflection towards the end of the reading, when I do really have a sense that hope, like other gifts from our God, are gifts that come not because we ask for them, but because they are given out of God's grace and out of God's awareness of our needs far better than we know our needs. And I will say with regard, it was interesting, Jane, I think you had sent to me in a text earlier this week, interest in knowing about these two gentlemen. It caused me to recall that Dad did tell me in subsequent months and years that he met both of them when they were back in their parishes. Park Chung-hee was assassinated the following year, and within a few years thereafter, Korea began to move towards what we know of as democracy, and in due course, Ferdinand Marcos was removed, ousted. We can look for David because he could fill us in far more detail from his awareness. But the church, what's interesting is, as I recall my dad describing it, the church's quiet, insistent work, including leadership that would be, tossed into prison or harassed, and church services would be harassed. The churches ultimately, in my estimation, I think from what Dad was describing, had an impact on both of the cultural scenes. And in some respects, there's a part of me that says that's a reflection of the way in which God worked. God said to these two men, by way of example, there is work to do. Trust. And that there is a connection between the way in which redemption moves into unredeemable situations, and God uses us in ways that sometimes we're open to and other times we're shocked by, not even knowing that we're going to be on the receiving end to be party to. But in answer to Jane's question and kind of, your puerile one, both of them ultimately were released. And in some respects, it's interesting because, we're losing him soon, obviously, from what we hear in the news. But Jimmy Carter, my dad said, was insistent in the way in which he engaged on the world scene in ways that other presidents have done far less so. And because the U.S. was so requisite for those regimes to continue in power, Carter had the capacity to impact what was going on, and the church had a role in that. That was more than I should have said.
Judy Parr here, and one of the lines that most struck me, I think, was one toward the top of near the end. I happened to be the fortunate one to receive this priceless gift of both men telling me about hope in the most hopeless settings imaginable. He came to bring hope, but yet he received from these two men an unexpected hope from that. And it's, again, that reciprocal spirit working through both, all in this situation.
And if I might say in that regard, Judy, there is this kind of ripple effect in the sense that, Dad happened to be the one who was brought into those situations and was attentive enough to allow it to move him. he told me, and I wasn't the only person I'm sure that he told over the years, that was a formative experience for him. And even, quite frankly, what's happening here, my needing to tell this story, the ripple effect, and that's probably overstating a little bit, but the ripple effect in the way in which the Spirit speaks through the wider community, not just of the church, but outside the church as well, is not insignificant. Yep.
I'm Dave. I would like to reflect, starting with the gospel passage, with a little bit about the curtain was torn, which is a metaphor, a wonderful metaphor of the separation is gone and the light shines in. And how I often, I typically would think of this as, yes, this happened for me. But then reflecting again, I'm really the guy who followed the rip in the curtain with the needle and thread to sew the sucker back shut. That's who I've been. And in terms of this kind of thing, I lived through in Taiwan, some of the years I was there, people sort of stepping out and taking the risk to get arrested for standing up against the dictatorship that was in Taiwan until 1988. And so, okay, I saw that, and I would rejoice in that. But then I think of my own response to people I knew who had been active in such a thing as political movement and opposition and such, and then they'd had a charismatic experience, and how I discounted them. The light shined in upon them spiritually, and I put them in a box. Or we would hear from time to time about so-and-so who used to be so big, but now he's into this. And I'd go, oh yeah, I didn't see light in what he was into now. I saw only, okay, I can sew him up somehow. And that's more confessional than I had planned to be today, but I see that in myself as one who repairs the curtain to hold the darkness, to resist the light, or one who, when encountering someone who received light differently than I thought I had, I shut him up in a cell. Thank you.
Dave, thank you.
What is the significance of the torn
Yeah.
curtain in the temple?
From what I have come to understand about that torn curtain, it's pretty significant that the temple, when it was designed, had an inner court, sacred space that was reserved for only the high priest. The high priest was only allowed to enter there, I think, once a year on Yom Kippur to speak directly to God. The high priest was the designated intercessor for the people of God to go before the throne, and he would ask for forgiveness for the people's sins. And then if he received that forgiveness, he would come out and offer a benediction, the good word, to the people. And the oldest benediction in the Bible, uttered by Aaron, the first high priest, the Aaronic benediction, is often repeated. And at close of Christian services of worship, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you his peace. There was also an inner court, there was the sacred space, and then there was the inner court that was reserved for circumcised Jewish males in good standing with the community. And then there was an outer court where anybody could gather. It was sort of a community gathering place. And what we have in many Christian churches is an architectural memory of what once was. We have an outer court, we call it the narthex, or the place where people gather and they greet one another, they have coffee. We have the inner court that's now open. You don't have to be circumcised Jewish males. I'm glad ushers don't have to perform that at the door to check on people. And then we have the sacred space that usually is a chancel. When I served as a pastor in England, I discovered by accident that the British Methodists who were there really valued that sacred space in a way that I was far too casual with. The first time I called the children up to come and sit with me on the steps of the chancel for the children's message, they went, and they didn't hear another word that I said for the rest of the, they thought, who is this? That in any event, when Jesus, when the curtain of the temple was torn in two, and whether that was literal or figurative, Jerusalem sits on top of, I think, 3 tectonic plates, and earthquakes are known there. It represented a change that, particularly in Hebrews, when it talks about Christ as our high priest, that Christ is now the one who goes before God and intercedes on our behalf. I hope that's helpful.
Yep. Thank you, Glenn.
One other piece that came to mind from the story, some years ago I took a trip to Jerusalem and to study the Bible on location through Jerusalem University College. And I'd planned for that trip for a long time. It was going to be the fulfillment of a dream. I went with a very good friend from Muskegon. I was going to meet my roommate from the American University of Beirut, who was in Oman, and we planned that trip afterwards. And about 3 days into the trip, I fell in the wilderness and broke my leg. I had to have surgery, was in a lot of pain, was lonely, was rather depressed about the whole thing. I thought, what a crappy way to, when I got over my depression, I said, okay, God, what do you want me to learn from this? And when I opened myself to the possibility that this was more than an accident, I began learning a whole lot about being broken that I never would have learned any other way. Anyway.
Thanks.
I just was struck in the Bible passage with verse 51. Never really thought of this before, but it says the curtain was torn from top to bottom. And I'm wondering if that's an expressive way to say that it was torn completely, or if it was meant to be, it indicates something directional. And I don't know. I mean, either one could fit. In Matthew, isn't it in Matthew where you have Mary's Magnificat, who there's a concern for the lowly, and that it was torn from the highest up until to the lowest. So I'm not really sure what to make of that, and there's some hope there.
Yep.
Top to bottom suggests hierarchy, so maybe the hierarchy is being dismantled.
Yep. When I decided to have these two passages in sequence with each other, one of the reasons I decided to do so was that they seem to be suggesting opposites, even though they are kind of a pair. In the first instance, the temple curtain is torn when Jesus dies, which is to suggest that Jesus isn't there. He is passed, but something has happened that is reflective of potentially the relationship between people of Israel and Yahweh, the God, who has been embedded and almost imprisoned there and is released. But the second passage from Hebrews is striking because there it suggests that Jesus is going in now. He says, we have this hope, a secure and steadfast anchor of the soul, hope that enters the inner shrine behind the curtain, where Jesus, a forerunner on our behalf, has entered, having become a high priest forever. So it may be that, these are both obviously images as opposed to historical descriptions, but they carry profound meaning for both of the audiences that are intended, presumably by those who are writing, the gospel writer and then the writer of Hebrews. For me, the reason I decided to have the second, though, was that the emphasis there is that with what has happened, with the full availability of our God to us and of our being welcomed into God's full presence, is that the benefit is hope. That hope is what is underscored by the writer of the Hebrews material. Anyway, that would be a different day's discussion. There are a few people around here that I'd love to have that conversation with who have some background in scriptural interpretation, but maybe not right now. If there are no other comments to be shared, then I'm inclined to say, turn with me, please, to the second reading, and I'd like to read that and maybe have a few minutes just to reflect together on it. Very different flavored reading, but the first half of this was given as a tease in the Salt and Light, and if you read it, you might have wondered why I just stopped there. It's because that's only half of what I intended to have us consider. This is entitled, How Could I Not? It was springtime some 2 decades ago, but I still remember it as vividly as if it had happened just last week. I was paying a pastoral call on a young mother and her 2 little children. Monica and her daughters were much-loved members of my parish and were enduring unbearably trying times. Monica's beloved husband had passed away very suddenly 2 years earlier, leaving behind a grieving and desperately impoverished threesome, including 2 preschoolers. As I had been doing with some regularity since her husband's tragic passing, I was stopping in to see how the little family was faring. When I had called a few minutes earlier, Monica had responded in her typically warm way, "Sure, come on by, Pastor Bob, we're not going anywhere." On arrival, the front door was open. Looking through the screen door into the living room, I saw Monica in the middle of the floor, busy with kids around her. She waved me in. On entry, I stepped gingerly around scattered toys. Monica looked up from diapering a squirming little one, pointing her chin in the direction of the cluttered couch. "Make yourself some space and have a seat, Pastor Bob," she said. I did so, and then took in the scene before me. I did a head count, coming up with a number well exceeding 3. In addition to Monica and her 2 little ones, including the squirmer now getting diapered by Mommy, I quickly noted 3 other preschoolers, all running about with toys in hand, raising a juvenile ruckus that would have roused the entombed Lazarus. It was a lively scene. I quickly realized I didn't recognize the additional 3 kids, who each gave me passing glances before continuing with their frolicking play together. I smiled at each, and then looked back at Monica, who was now patting the backside of the newly diapered tyke as she joined the cacophonous fray. Pushing herself up on her knees and then all the way upright, Monica gestured towards the nearby dining room table at one end of the living room. We grabbed seats and took in the living room, now turned into a wildly entertaining playroom. 5 youngsters enthralled with each other's joyous company. Understandably curious, I couldn't resist asking Monica the obvious question. 5 kids today, Monica. Wow. Who are the lucky little visitors? Monica looked smilingly at the rowdy 5-some tearing about the room and said, "They're Bonnie's kids." When she could tell by the look on my face that Bonnie's name was ringing no bells, she continued, "Bonnie's a neighbor friend from around the corner. She cleans houses whenever she gets a call to do so. She got an emergency request at 6:30 this morning, so she called me and asked if I could watch her kiddos for the morning." She smiled at the somewhat chaotic scene playing out in front of us and said, "So, here they are." That's when the surprise, no, the shock, unfolded for me. I said with a silly look on my face, "Win-win for the 2 of you, I guess." "How do you mean, Pastor Bob?" she responded, with a seriousness that made appropriate mockery of my facial expression. "Well, if she gets emergency child care help and you generate a little extra income from your household." To which Monica said, with a look of mild disbelief at my foolish naivete, "Oh, I'm not getting paid for watching her children. She has less money than I have." She paused an instant, during which time the serious nature of the moment soaked into my embarrassed soul. She said, "No, I'm simply doing this to help her out. It's a gift," she explained. I confess I then dim-wittedly asked, "How could you do this for free, given your own financial straits, Monica?" To which that amazing, yes, Christ-like young mother responded by saying, "How could I not?" An hour later, now back in my quiet study and beginning preparation for the forthcoming Sunday's Eastertide sermon, I found myself mulling over the jarring yet transformative visit I had just had with Monica. I realized she was a living reminder to me of what it means to embody the heart of Jesus, what it means to put into concrete, even countercultural action, the essence of our loving Lord's astonishing, self-sacrificial grace. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to consider Monica's astonishing heart of care and compassion for her equally needy friend. And as I did so, a lively picture of Jesus took shape. It was a week or two after his resurrection, and just a short time prior to his forthcoming ascension. Jesus was with some of his disciples, quietly teaching them and encouraging them for what lay ahead. As he did so, I envisioned one or another of those still starry-eyed disciples fidgeting a bit, eager to ask his risen master a nagging question. That disciple was still in a state of astonishment, bordering on disbelief, that he was actually talking in the flesh with the same man whom he had seen some days earlier dying on a cross. When Jesus paused for a few quiet moments, the disciple finally gathered himself and spoke. "Help me to understand, Lord. You allowed yourself to be betrayed by one of us, denied by one of us, abandoned by all of us, arrested by your enemies, falsely accused by the religious leaders, unjustly tortured by the Romans, crucified between two thieves, and then buried in a cold cave." The disciples stared at Jesus, who looked back at him with startling gentility. Then the disciple asked, "How could you do all of that? How?" As I sat quietly at my desk, eyes still closed and beginning to tear up, I could hear Jesus respond to his honestly confounded follower, "How could I not?" Then after a moment of rich silence, he continued, "That was what my Father sent me to do. And I love you, each and every one." And after another moment, or an eternity, he said again, "How could I not?" Some 2 millennia later, I sat in my study, listening now to both Monica and Jesus. I confessed with speechless humility in that moment, as I still do, that they speak for the divine. They speak for the Spirit of God and all that the Spirit has been about since that astonishing Pentecost moment in the temple when spiritual gifts were given to the newborn community of faith who had come to be known as the body of Christ. Since that Pentecost day, the same Spirit has empowered, instructed, consoled, and inspired. That same Spirit has given to God's people what we need, sometimes, maybe always, well before we even know we need it. And just as I did with Monica And just as that disciple did with the risen Jesus, we may well find ourselves asking our loving God, how could you give us such gifts? How could you see fit to give us all we need and more? To which our God always, always responds by saying, I love you. How could I not? I'll start by saying each time I have reread this since I wrote it in this past year, I have difficulty not choking up. Hearing Monica, seeing Monica, and envisioning Jesus in that similar vein. For me, and this is one of the reasons why I decided I really wanted to read this in the circle this morning, she captures and embodies for me who Jesus is. And maybe that's why the curtain was torn from top to bottom, get down to Monica. Because she's the one that still teaches me.
I'm Dan, saying it again. What I'm wondering about is I appreciate deeply the connection between Monica's heart and the heart of Christ that you're drawing. There's that is so true, it's so profound. But I think you would also acknowledge that there is an asymmetry as well. They're not exactly the same. And what I'm saying is that so they're each feeling a good compulsion, a necessity. How could I not?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But it seems for the divine one, for Jesus Christ, this is a necessity that's entirely internal. It comes from who he is, not from any sort of external compulsion or moral comparison. This is simply who Jesus as the incarnate one is. And there is a portion of that that's true for Monica as well. If how could I not? This is who I am. But I don't think that was probably foremost in her reasoning. If you were to ask her, what do you mean? How could I not? She might say, well, this is how Jesus is. She would have the reason be outside of herself in an appropriate way. And so there's kind of a mixture of internal and external, I would expect, for Monica and for any of us who might say, how could I not? We're not claiming to be entirely, we're not claiming to be all that. We're saying that our reason for it behaving in this integral way is not because of something internal to us, but something that maybe has been put there, but we're using as our guide something external to us. And maybe I should stop.
And I just want to thank you so much. I'm Joyce. I guess we're supposed to introduce ourselves. And thanks so much, Bob, for leading this. And for me, with the story of Monica, it also brings out the Christ the servant issue, where Christ has, as I've been raised through my upbringing, just knowing that you have that sense of service and following in Christ's lead in that way. And I just felt like this story really helped with that, and that Christ, following Christ as a servant and doing that in our own lives as we serve others, that's just a really wonderful way to look at it.
Just following on what Joyce said, I'm Dave. The Monica story got me to thinking, who were the Monicas in my life whom I've observed? And there are people within this circle, I think, who I see as being people for others, who are always there. I mean, if there's something to be done, they're willing to give themselves and to support one another, to support our community, so forth. So we have our own Monicas, too.
Judy, want to go to Glenn?
Judy? Thank you.
David, thank you. I'm Glenn, and that same thought came to me as I heard that story, that there's a whole lot of people who, by their life, their example, their witness, I find my little voice inside me saying, God, help me to grow like that too. And I think that's one of the powerful ways that Christian witness works, that when we get it right, when we love as Jesus calls us to love, or we serve as he calls us to serve, something happens spiritually that transmits the love and grace of Christ to others.
When I think about the previous story, I think about some people might ask the two pastors, why did you speak out? Why did you do that when you knew you could go to prison? And a response very well might be, how could I not? And also for Bob's father, of going to visit, for me, there would be a lot of fear. I mean, we know journalists and others who have walked into such situations with individuals and not returned. And so when asked to go visit these people, again, the response would be, how could I not?
I'm reminded, this is just tangential, but it comes to mind given what you just said, Jane. I remember talking with my mother way back when I was maybe a teenager, and she was explaining that when she and Dad in the early 40s were in conversation with the Reformed Church's mission board about indeed entering into mission work, which is what they did in the Middle East beginning in the late 40s. Well, they got there in 44. They were warned that on average, 1 out of every 2 Reformed Church ministers would be buried overseas. That is to say, there's a 50% cost factor in serving overseas. And they needed to know that ahead of time, especially to warn their loved ones back here in the States that they might not come back. And I remember, hearing Mom describe that, and I don't remember an expression of how could we not, but the essence of what she described after the fact. Now, we were already back here in the States. They had come back after being overseas for 2 decades or more, and now we're in the United States where Dad was working with the National Council of Churches. But for her, it was tantamount to, if we feel called to be missionaries, whatever the price is to be paid. And in a sense, the same essence was, how could we not do it if this is what we're called to do, in spite of the cost or the price thereof?
It's Judy here. And Paul Husingveld of our own congregation knows that very personally because his father was murdered as part of his military of his missionary service.
Yep, and is buried in Oman. Yep. Dan, I'm not sure exactly. I'm going to have to parse out your fascinating question about the contrast between Jesus and Monica. There's a part of me that says I think this is one of those paradoxes where they are two totally different individuals, but they are two the same. And in some respects, Monica and how she was living, I'm not certain if her motivation was different than, or her compulsion other than what drove or led Jesus from day to day in his work. I don't think there's any question that his understanding of his identity was unique, as the gospel writers suggest when he says, you see me, you see the Father that sent me. So that there was this sense of absolute uniqueness of the person of Jesus in contrast to any of the rest of us. And yet, in some respects, there is a part of me that says, and this may have to do with the whole concept of the way the Trinity works, the way the Spirit rebirths us, that Monica indeed becomes Christ-like. And And there's a part of me that hesitates to say that her motivation and what drove her is distinctively other than that which did Jesus. And in some respects, the commonality in both is as I try to write it here in the piece, is that the essence of agape is what defines a child of God, be it the son named Jesus of Nazareth, or the daughter or son named Monica or Mark or whomever, that the Spirit literally transforms and gives birth to that which enables a person to say, how could I not, without a thought, that it becomes, in a sense, the essence of that person's motivating mission. So I'm reticent about overly differentiating between Jesus and Monica. There's a part of me that says I like pairing the two. And in doing so, there's a part of me that says I resonate with pairing each and all of us with our Redeemer. We are now at...
Your choice of Monica.
Yep.
Monica is the mother of St. Augustine, and I think was very instrumental in his conversion. And so I'm thinking that's another resonance that comes to this.
It's interesting because what I've done in writing, these are all pseudonyms, right? So no one back in Altamont, New York can know who Monica is because Monica doesn't have two preschooler daughters. And I've had a couple of other instances where the names I have chosen, by way of example, and take 30 seconds, I've written a piece about abortion. The first person that approached me to reflect upon abortion was someone in my first parish, just 10 years after Roe v. Wade, 40 years ago. I gave her the name Miriam, M-I-R-I-A-M, because I didn't know anybody named Miriam. And one of my loved ones, when she read that story, said, "Why did you choose Mary's name, the Virgin?" And I said, "I didn't." She said, "That's who it is, Dad." And I wasn't aware of it. She caught it. And I wasn't aware that Monica was St. Augustine's mother. That names carry huge significance, sometimes far beyond any awareness. And with that, we better stop. I'm just going to close with a brief word of prayer, if I may. Lord, send us into our time of worship to be restored, renewed, so that we might this week be your presence in the lives of all to whom you give us in your name. For we pray it in your name. Amen.
Thank you, Bob, for this 3-part series. We're most appreciative. Yeah, thank you for leading us into Lent this way. Next week, we begin the 2-part series with the elders talking about reproductive rights. Next week will be a panel with the elders, and then the following week, Paula, the president and CEO from Michigan Planned Parenting, will be here. So that'll be the next. Cam, did you have a question? Yeah, what time will those? We go from 9:40. It's like, yeah, I changed my clock this morning. 9:40 to 10:40 every week. Yep. Thank you. Thank you.